They say a grave with no name carries more weight than one etched in stone. For in silence the earth swallows not only bodies but their very memory. And in the pine-shadowed hills of Alabama, 1822, there is a field of graves where children lay, nameless, voiceless, and forgotten. Yet the soil remembers what the world chose to erase. Tonight, we descend into a tale that will chill your bones and haunt your dreams. A story of innocence lost, of greed disguised as charity, and of the terrible price paid when the dead refused to stay silent. This is not merely a ghost story, it is a reckoning. The morning mist clung to the Alabama hills like the breath of the dead, and through it emerged a sight that should have brought comfort to weary travelers. The Whitlock orphanage, its timber walls rising against the gray sky like a fortress of hope. But hope, like mist, can deceive the eye. Widow Elmira Whitlock stood at her front door, watching the wagon approach. Her black dress hung loose on her gaunt frame, and her silver hair was pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the pale skin of her face. She was a woman carved from winter itself, cold, sharp, and unforgiving. The children in her care learned quickly to read the weather in her gray eyes, and today those eyes held storm clouds. The wagon carried 3 new souls, Elias barely 12, whose small hands bore the calluses of a boy forced to work too young, Miriam perhaps 10, so frail the wind seemed ready to carry her away like a dried leaf, and Jonah, the oldest at 13, whose defiant green eyes burned with the kind of fire that authority sought to extinguish. "Welcome to your new home," Elmira said, her voice carrying the false warmth of honey poured over ice. "Here you will learn discipline. You will learn prayer. You will learn that God provides for those who ask no questions." The house itself seemed to breathe around them as they entered. The scent of lavender water and lye soap filled the air, masking something else, something sour and heavy, that seemed to seep from the very walls. 23 children lived within these walls, ranging in age from 6 to 16. They moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their voices barely above whispers. Elias noticed it first, the way the other children watched them with a mixture of pity and warning in their eyes. During their first meal, a thin gruel served in silence, he caught the gaze of a girl named Ruth. She was perhaps 14, with hollow cheeks and knowing eyes that had seen too much. When Elmira's back was turned, Ruth leaned close to the newcomers. "Keep your heads down," she whispered, her words barely audible above the scraping of spoons against wooden bowls. "Don't ask questions. Don't make noise. And whatever you do, don't go near the field behind the house after dark." Jonah's jaw tightened. He had lived on the streets long enough to recognize fear when he saw it, and Ruth's fear was bone deep, the kind that came from witnessing something unspeakable. "What's in the field?" he whispered back. Ruth's face went white. She glanced toward Elmira, who was speaking in low tones to one of the older boys. "Silence," Ruth breathed. Eternal silence. That first night, as they lay on their straw mattresses in the boys' dormitory, Elias carved a small figure from a piece of pine he'd found in the yard. His knife moved carefully, lovingly, creating the face of a child, not any particular child, but the essence of childhood itself, innocent and wandering. It was a habit he'd developed in his previous placement, before the fever took his guardians. The dolls comforted him somehow, as if by creating these little faces, he could preserve something pure in a world that seemed determined to crush it. Miriam, sleeping in the girls' quarters, found no such comfort. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaking of old wood, the whisper of wind through broken shutters, and beneath it all, something else. A sound that might have been singing, so faint she couldn't be sure it wasn't her imagination. Her own voice had always been her gift and her curse. In her previous home, they'd called her their little nightingale, but here Elmira had made it clear that unnecessary singing was a sign of vanity, and vanity was a sin. Jonah stared at the ceiling, counting the water stains and planning. He had survived 3 years on his own after his parents died of cholera, and he had learned that adults who spoke of God's will usually had their own will in mind. There was something wrong with this place, something that went deeper than harsh discipline or meager meals. It was in the way Elmira's eyes lingered on certain children, in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the careful distance the other orphans maintained from the windows that faced the back field. The next morning brought their first real glimpse of Elmira's true nature. During morning prayers, a boy named Samuel whispered a question to his neighbor about their chores for the day. The sound was barely audible, but Elmira's head snapped toward him like a serpent sensing prey. "Samuel," she said, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk, "step forward." The boy, perhaps 8 years old, trembled as he approached. Without warning, Elmira's hand cracked across his face, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Samuel stumbled but did not cry. These children had learned that tears only brought more punishment. "God hears all words," Elmira intoned, her gray eyes fixed on Samuel's reddening cheek. "Even the ones we think are whispered in secret. Remember that, children. God is always listening, and so am I." But it was what happened next that truly chilled the newcomer's blood. As Samuel returned to his place, Miriam noticed that Elmira's hand lingered on a key that hung from a chain around her neck. It was old iron, blackened with age, and as her fingers touched it, her lips moved in what might have been a prayer, or might have been something else entirely. That evening, as the children prepared for bed, Elias noticed something that made his blood run cold. The bed next to his, which had been occupied by a quiet boy named Thomas just that morning, stood empty. The straw mattress was gone, the wooden frame bare. "Where's Thomas?" he whispered to the boy on his other side. The boy's eyes went wide with terror. He shook his head violently and turned away, pulling his thin blanket over his head. Later, when the house had settled into uneasy sleep, Elias crept to the window that faced the back field. The moon was full, casting silver light over what should have been empty ground. But the field was not empty. Small mounds dotted the earth like sleeping animals, and among them walked a familiar figure in black. Elmira moved between the mounds with purpose, her lips moving in constant whispered conversation. But with whom was she speaking? The dead don't answer back. Or do they? As Elias watched, transfixed with horror, Elmira knelt beside one of the fresher mounds, a small hillock that hadn't been there the day before. She placed her hands on the earth and leaned close, as if listening for something buried beneath. Then she straightened, nodded as if satisfied, and began to walk back toward the house. But just before she reached the door, something made her stop and turn. Her gaze swept the windows of the orphanage, until it found Elias, frozen at his window like a deer caught in torchlight. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the moonlit yard. Then Elmira smiled, a cold, knowing expression that promised terrible consequences for curious boys who asked questions in the dark. The next morning, Thomas was never mentioned again. When Jonah asked about the empty bed, Elmira simply clasped her iron key and whispered, "God has taken his lamb home. We do not question his will." But questions have a way of growing in the dark, like mushrooms in a cellar. And in the Whitlock orphanage, the darkness was deeper than any of them had yet imagined. Tell me, dear listeners, have you ever noticed how silence can be more terrifying than any scream? How can the absence of sound fill your ears until you think you might go mad from the weight of unspoken truths? Subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon, because the truth we're about to uncover will shake you to your very core. The days at the Whitlock orphanage fell into a rhythm as steady and merciless as a funeral march. Dawn brought prayers, whispered in voices so low they seemed to sink into the floorboards rather than rise to heaven. Breakfast was thin porridge and thinner hope. The children worked, scrubbing floors until their knuckles bled, tending a vegetable garden that never seemed to yield enough food, mending clothes that were already more patchy than original fabric. But it was the nights that truly belonged to dread. Elias had taken to carving his wooden dolls in secret, hiding them beneath his mattress when the lights went out. Each face he created seemed to capture something he couldn't quite name, a sadness perhaps, or a longing for something lost. Miriam found herself humming under her breath during chores, melodies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond memory. And Jonah watched. He watched everything. 3 weeks after their arrival, the patterns began to emerge like constellations in a dark sky, visible only to those who knew how to look. Elmira's nightly walks to the field had become as regular as clockwork. Every evening, after the children were sent to bed, she would take her black shawl from its hook by the door and step out into the Alabama night. The children learned to track her movements by the creak of floorboards, the whisper of her skirts against the walls, the soft click of the back door's latch. But it was Jonah who first noticed that she wasn't walking to the field alone. "Listen," he whispered to Elias and Miriam during one of their stolen moments behind the woodshed. "When she goes out there, she talks, not to herself, to them, to whoever's buried in those mounds." Miriam shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The dead don't talk back," she said, but her voice carried no conviction. "Don't they?" Elias asked quietly. He had been thinking about Thomas, about the empty bed that no one mentioned, about the way Elmira had looked at him through the window that night. Maybe they do, and we just don't know how to listen. The iron key around Elmira's neck had become another source of fascination and fear. She touched it constantly during prayers, while serving meals whenever one of the children displeased her. It was older than the house itself perhaps, and it bore strange markings that seemed to shift in the candlelight. None of the children had ever seen a lock that might fit. But Ruth had theories. She found them one evening behind the chicken coop, where the older children sometimes gathered to share whispered conversations that never reached adult ears. "That key," she said without preamble, her voice barely audible above the sound of insects in the grass. "My grandmother told me about keys like that. Before she died, before I came here, she said some locks aren't meant to keep things out. They're meant to keep things in." "What kind of things?" Elias asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Ruth glanced toward the house, where Elmira's silhouette could be seen moving past a downstairs window. "The kind of things that should stay buried." That night, a storm rolled across the Alabama hills with unusual fury. Lightning split the sky like God's own anger, and thunder shook the orphanage until the children feared the roof might collapse upon them. But it was during the storm that they heard it, voices in the wind, high and thin and desperately sad. Elias pressed his face to the window, trying to see through the sheets of rain. The field behind the house was a churning sea of mud and shadow, but in the lightning flashes he could swear he saw shapes moving among the mounds. Small shapes, child-sized, their arms reaching toward the house as if pleading for something, warmth perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that they had once existed. Miriam sat bolt upright in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear the voices too, but not just as sound. They seemed to vibrate through her bones, calling to something deep inside her chest. Without thinking, she began to hum, matching the pitch and rhythm of the wind-carried cries. The other girls in the dormitory stirred restlessly in their sleep, but Miriam barely noticed. The voices were so clear now, so beautiful in their sorrow. And in the eye of the storm, Elmira Whitlock stood in her field of graves, her arms raised to the lightning-torn sky, her mouth moving in words that were older than prayer and darker than sin. The rain plastered her hair to her skull and soaked through her nightgown, but she felt none of it. She was listening to her children, her buried children, as they sang their eternal lament. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely quiet. But the quiet was deceptive, like the surface of a deep well that gave no hint of the darkness beneath. During breakfast, Ruth slipped Elias a piece of paper torn from what might once have been a book. On it, written in pencil so faint it was barely visible, were words that made his blood freeze. Names don't matter here. We're not meant to be remembered. He showed the note to Jonah and Miriam when they were alone. Jonah crumpled it in his fist, his green eyes blazing with anger. "She's wrong," he said fiercely. "Names always matter. People always matter. We won't be forgotten." But Miriam stared at the torn paper with an expression of growing understanding and growing fear. "What if that's the point?" she whispered. "What if being forgotten is exactly what happens here? What if that's what Elmira wants?" That evening, as the children gathered for prayers, Elmira's sermon took on a different tone. She spoke of sacrifice, of the necessity of letting go of earthly attachments, including, she said with particular emphasis, the vanity of believing oneself important enough to be remembered. "God knows each sparrow that falls," she intoned, her grey eyes sweeping across the assembled children like searchlights seeking prey. "But God does not carve their names in stone. In his wisdom, he allows the wind to scatter their bones, the rain to wash away their traces. In this way, they become one with his creation, unmarked and unnamed." Elias felt his wooden doll pressing against his leg through his pocket. Each figure he carved was his way of saying you mattered, you existed, you were here. But listening to Elmira's words, he began to understand that this was exactly the kind of remembrance she sought to destroy. After prayers, as the children filed toward their dormitories, Miriam lingered near the windows that faced the field. The mounds were clearly visible in the dying light, more numerous than she had first realized. 30, perhaps 40 small graves, scattered across the earth like seeds planted by some terrible gardener. And as she watched, the strangest thing happened. The evening breeze stirred through the pine trees that bordered the field, and she could swear she heard her name whispered among the branches. Not called out, whispered, as if the very air knew her and was trying to warn her of something. "Miriam," the wind seemed to sigh. "Miriam, sing for us, sing us home." She stepped closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her, the other children had gone to bed, but she remained transfixed by the sound of her name carried on the night air. Without thinking, she began to hum the melody that had been haunting her dreams, the same tune she had heard during the storm, the same rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very foundations of the house. And in the field, something stirred. The earth above one of the mounds shifted slightly, as if whatever lay beneath was trying to respond to her song. Miriam's humming grew stronger, more confident, and more mounds began to tremble. It was as if her voice was a key, and she was learning, note by note, which locks it might open. From her window upstairs, Elmira Whitlock watched the girl with a mixture of satisfaction and hunger. The vessel had arrived at last, the one she had been waiting for, the one whose voice could bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of the forgotten dead. Soon, very soon, her collection would be complete. But first, there were still lessons to be taught. Lessons about the price of curiosity, the danger of questions, and the terrible consequences that awaited children who refused to accept their place in her careful design. In the morning, she would begin Miriam's true education. Tonight, she would simply watch and listen as the girl sang to her buried brothers and sisters, calling them closer to the surface with every beautiful, haunting note. Curiosity, they say, is the deadliest sin of the young. It drives them to peer behind curtains, to ask forbidden questions, to seek answers in places where only shadows dwell. For Jonah Blackwood, curiosity had kept him alive on the streets, teaching him which alleys to avoid, which merchants would share a crust of bread, which strangers wore kindness as a mask for darker intentions. But at the Whitlock orphanage, curiosity might prove to be his doom. The 4th week of their stay brought changes that only the most observant would notice. Elmira had begun paying special attention to Miriam, calling her aside after meals for what she termed private instruction. These sessions took place in the parlor, behind closed doors, and when Miriam emerged, she seemed increasingly distant, as if part of her was drifting away with each passing day. Elias noticed it first, the way Miriam's eyes seemed to focus on things the rest of them couldn't see, the way she hummed fragments of melodies that made the other children restless and afraid. During one evening meal, her humming grew so loud that the youngest children began to cry without knowing why, and Elmira had to sharply command her to stop. But it was Jonah who decided that waiting for answers was a luxury they could no longer afford. Elmira's quarters occupied the entire upper floor of the house's west wing, a section that was strictly forbidden to the children. The stairs leading up were old oak, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and they creaked like the bones of the dying when any weight was placed upon them. But Jonah had learned to move like smoke when he lived on the streets, silent, swift, nearly invisible. He waited until the deepest part of night, when even the oldest children had long since fallen asleep. The house settled around him with sighs and whispers, and somewhere in the distance he could hear Elmira's voice drifting from the field, speaking her nightly words to the buried dead. This was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to discover what secrets the widow kept locked away. The stairs protested softly under his bare feet, but years of practice had taught him exactly how to distribute his weight to minimize sound. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched before him, lit only by moonlight filtering through a single grimy window. 3 doors led off the corridor, one to Elmira's bedroom, one to what appeared to be a storage room, and one that stood slightly ajar, revealing the edge of a heavy wooden desk. Her study. It had to be. Jonah slipped through the partially open door like a shadow given substance. The room was spartanly furnished. The desk, a single chair, shelves lined with religious texts, and what appeared to be record books. A crucifix hung on the wall, its bronze surface green with age, and beneath it sat a small shrine decorated with dried flowers and a single black candle. But it was the desk that drew his attention. Its surface was neat to the point of obsession, papers stacked with mathematical precision, an inkwell positioned exactly parallel to the desk's edge, a single pen laid at a perfect right angle to a leather-bound ledger that sat open in the center. The ledger. Jonah's heart hammered as he approached it, his bare feet silent on the worn wooden floor. This book, whatever it contained, was clearly the heart of Elmira's operation. The pages were filled with her careful script, each entry meticulously recorded in columns and rows. But as his eyes adjusted to the moonlight streaming through the window, what he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. No names. The ledger contained no names at all. Instead, each entry was labeled with a number: child 27, child 28, child 29. Each number was followed by a date of arrival, a brief physical description: brown hair, blue eyes, slight build or red hair, freckles, missing front tooth. And then, most chilling of all, a final date accompanied by a single word: gone, unfit, taken, prepared. Jonah's hands trembled as he turned the pages, counting backward through the entries. 37 numbers total, 37 children who had passed through these doors and been reduced to nothing more than clinical observations in Elmira's careful records. Thomas, sweet, quiet Thomas, who had disappeared just weeks ago, was child 36. The date of his preparation was the very night Elias had seen Elmira kneeling by that fresh mound in the field. But it was the final entry that stopped Jonah's heart entirely. Child 37. Arrived October 15, 1822. Female, approximately 10 years of age. Blonde hair, blue eyes, extremely frail build. Notable characteristic: exceptional vocal ability. Preparation scheduled November 3rd, 1822. November 3rd. That was tomorrow night. Child 37 was Miriam. The ledger slipped from Jonah's nerveless fingers, but he managed to catch it before it hit the floor. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. Preparation. What did that word mean in Elmira's twisted vocabulary? And why was Miriam marked as different from the others, scheduled rather than simply noted as gone or taken? He forced himself to keep reading, to search for any clue that might explain the widow's purpose. Near the back of the ledger, he found a section that made his skin crawl with revulsion. It was titled Terms of Agreement, and written in two different hands, Elmira's careful script, and something else, something that seemed to have been burned into the page rather than written with ink. The agreement was brief, but horrifying in its clarity. In exchange for continued prosperity and protection, Elmira would provide 37 vessels for eternal work. The children would be prepared according to ancient custom and bound to service beyond the veil of death. In return, she would receive dominion over her earthly domain and immunity from the natural decay of time. At the bottom of the page were two signatures. Elmira's was recognizable, but the other was unlike anything Jonah had ever seen, not letters or words, but symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the moonlight, as if they were alive. A floorboard creaked behind him. Jonah spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but the doorway was empty. Still, he could feel eyes upon him, watching from the shadows. He had lingered too long, taken too great a risk. With trembling fingers, he closed the ledger and placed it exactly as he had found it, then crept toward the door. The hallway stretched before him, darker now that clouds had covered the moon. Each step back toward the stairs felt like an eternity, and with every footfall he expected to hear Elmira's voice cutting through the darkness, demanding to know what he was doing in her private domain. But he made it to the staircase and down to the main floor, and finally back to his dormitory, where the other boys slept in blissful ignorance of the horror that awaited them all. Only when he was safely beneath his thin blanket did Jonah allow himself to truly absorb what he had discovered. 37 children. Miriam was to be the 37th, the final payment in some hellish bargain Elmira had struck with forces beyond human understanding. But why was she different? Why was she to be prepared rather than simply killed and buried like the others? The answer came to him like a whisper in the dark. Her voice, her beautiful, haunting voice that seemed to call to the dead and stir the very earth beneath their feet. Elmira needed Miriam for something specific, something that required her to be alive, or at least not entirely dead. Dawn was still hours away when Jonah finally fell into troubled sleep, his dreams filled with numbered children and contracts signed in blood. When morning came, he would have to find a way to warn Elias and Miriam without alerting Elmira to what he had discovered. But how do you tell someone that they have been marked for death, that their days are numbered in a ledger kept by a woman who has made a pact with darkness itself? And more importantly, how do you convince them to run when every door seems to lead deeper into the trap? The next day dawned gray and cold, with the promise of rain hanging heavy in the air. During morning prayers, Jonah caught Miriam's eye and saw something there that chilled him acceptance. It was as if she already knew her fate, as if Elmira's private instructions had been preparing her to accept whatever was coming. When the widow announced that evening prayers would be replaced with a special ceremony to welcome their newest family members, Jonah knew that time had run out. Whatever Elmira had planned for Miriam, it would happen tonight. And unless he could find a way to stop it, child 37 would join her numbered siblings in the field of unmarked graves behind the house. November 3rd arrived with a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep through the very walls of the Whitlock orphanage. The children woke to find frost covering the windows in patterns that looked disturbingly like grasping fingers, and the air itself felt heavy with anticipation, the kind of electric tension that precedes a violent storm. Jonah had spent the night in agony, torn between the desperate need to warn his friends and the terrible knowledge that revealing what he had learned might only hasten their doom. How could he explain that he had seen Miriam's death scheduled in a ledger like an appointment with the devil himself? How could he make them understand that Elmira was not merely cruel, but something far worse? a creature who had traded her humanity for dark power and eternal life. But as morning wore on, and he watched Miriam moving through her chores with the distant, dreamy expression that had become increasingly common, Jonah realized that time for subtlety had passed. Whatever was going to happen would happen tonight, and he would rather die fighting than watch his friends disappear one by one into unmarked graves. It was during the midday meal that their world changed forever. The sound came first, hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth of the drive, approaching at a measured pace that spoke of someone who was in no hurry because they knew their destination would wait. The children instinctively quieted, their spoons pausing halfway to their mouths as they strained to listen. Visitors were rare at the Whitlock orphanage, and those few who did come usually brought bad news or took children away to fates unknown. Through the dining room window, Elias caught the first glimpse of their visitor. The horse was pale gray, almost white, with eyes that seemed to reflect light like mirrors. Its rider was tall and thin, dressed in black from head to toe, black coat, black hat, black gloves that gripped the reins with unnatural steadiness. Even from a distance there was something wrong about the figure, something that made Elias's carved dolls feel like living flesh in his pocket. But it was Elmira's reaction that truly frightened them. The widow, who had never shown surprise or uncertainty in all their weeks at the orphanage, suddenly straightened like a soldier called to attention. Her face, normally composed in lines of cold authority, showed something the children had never seen before: nervousness. She smoothed her dark skirts, touched the iron key at her throat, and walked quickly to the front door. When she opened it, her voice carried clearly through the house, warm, welcoming, eager, in a way that made every child's skin crawl. "You're early," she said, and there was something almost flirtatious in her tone. "I wasn't expecting you until after nightfall." The man's response was barely audible, a whisper that seemed to slide through the air like smoke, but his words reached them anyway. "The appointed time approaches. I came to ensure all preparations are complete." The children exchanged glances full of terror and confusion. Appointed time? Preparations? Jonah's mind raced back to the ledger, to the entry marked for November 3rd, to the symbols that had seemed to burn themselves into the page. Elmira led their visitor to the parlor, closing the door firmly behind them, but the old house had thin walls and eager ears. For the next hour, muffled voices drifted through the corridors, Elmira's sharp and occasionally defensive, the stranger's soft but somehow more frightening for its very quietness. The children tried to go about their afternoon chores, but everyone was listening, straining to catch fragments of the conversation that would determine their fates. Ruth, always the bravest of the older children, crept close to the parlor door and pressed her ear against the wood. What she heard made her face go white as winter snow. "The vessel must be willing," the man was saying. "Coercion corrupts the binding. She must choose her fate, or the compact fails." "She will choose," Elmira replied, confidence returning to her voice. "I have been preparing for her for weeks. She understands her purpose now, understands that she is meant for something greater than this earthly existence. And the others, the witnesses, they will serve their purpose as well. Fear strengthens the ritual, gives weight to the chosen one's sacrifice. They will watch, and they will understand that resistance is futile." Ruth crept back to the others, her hands shaking as she related what she had heard. The words made little sense to most of them, but Jonah understood enough to feel his blood turn to ice. They were all part of Elmira's plan, not just Miriam, but all of them. Witnesses to some unholy ceremony that would bind his friend to service beyond death itself. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. The man in black remained in the parlor with Elmira, and occasionally the children could hear them moving around, rearranging furniture, speaking in voices too low to understand. But there was something else, a sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the house, a low humming that made their teeth ache and their hearts race. Miriam seemed almost oblivious to the tension around her. She moved through her chores like a sleepwalker, humming softly under her breath. When Elias tried to talk to her, she looked at him with eyes that seemed to be focused on something far beyond the walls of the orphanage. "It's beautiful," she said dreamily when he asked what she was thinking about. "The music, can't you hear it? It's calling me home." Elias grabbed her shoulders, trying to shake her back to reality. "Miriam, this isn't your home. These people, they want to hurt you. We need to leave tonight, before—" But she pulled away from him with surprising strength, her blue eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "Leave," she repeated, as if the word were foreign. "Why would I want to leave? This is where I belong. This is where I belong." As darkness fell over the Alabama hills, Elmira finally emerged from the parlor. Her face was flushed with excitement, and the iron key around her neck seemed to pulse with its own dark light. She called all the children to gather in the main hall, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no disobedience. "Children," she announced, her gray eyes gleaming with anticipation, "tonight you will witness something remarkable. Tonight one of your number will be chosen for a great honor to serve not just in this world, but in the next, to become a bridge between the living and the dead. A voice for those who have no voice." The man in black emerged from the parlor behind her, and in the lamplight the children could finally see him clearly. He was tall and unnaturally thin, with skin so pale it seemed translucent. His eyes were dark holes in his face, and when he smiled his teeth were too white and too sharp. But it was his hands that truly terrified them. His black gloves had been removed, revealing fingers that were too long, too jointed, ending in nails that curved like talons. And on his palm, burned into the flesh like a brand, was the same symbol that had writhed at the bottom of the contract in Elmira's ledger. "Children," he said, and his voice was like the whisper of wind through a graveyard, "do not fear what is to come. Death is not an ending, it is a transformation. And one among you is destined for the most beautiful transformation of all." His gaze swept across the assembled orphans until it found Miriam, and when their eyes met, she smiled. It was not the smile of a frightened child, but of someone who had found her purpose at last. Jonah stepped forward, his heart hammering but his voice steady. "Let her go," he said, surprising himself with his own courage. "Whatever you want, take me instead. Leave her alone." The man in black laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, brave boy. But you misunderstand. This is not about taking, this is about giving. And the gift can only come from one who offers it freely." He turned back to Miriam, extending one of his impossible hands toward her. "Come, child. It is time to take your place among the eternal choir." And to the horror of everyone watching, Miriam stepped forward without hesitation, reaching out to take the stranger's hand. But before their fingers could touch, Jonah threw himself between them, grabbing Miriam's wrist and pulling her back. "No," he shouted. "I won't let you take her." The man in black's face twisted with rage, and suddenly the air in the room grew thick and suffocating. The lamps flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls, and from somewhere far below, from the basement, or perhaps from the earth itself, came a sound like grinding stone. "Foolish boy," the creature hissed, and now there was nothing human in his voice at all. "You dare interfere with the compact? You dare stand between the collector and his due?" Elmira stepped forward, her face contorted with fury. "Seize him," she commanded the older boys. "Hold him fast. He will not spoil what has taken years to arrange." But as hands reached for Jonah, the sound from below grew louder, and the house itself began to shake. Through the windows they could see the field behind the house, and the small mounds that dotted its surface were moving, shifting, as if whatever lay beneath was trying to claw its way back to the surface. Miriam's voice rose above the chaos, not in the dreamy humming she had been doing for weeks, but in a pure, clear song that seemed to cut through the darkness like a blade of light. And as she sang, the dead began to answer. The man in black snarled and reached for her again, but the song grew stronger, and the house shook more violently. Outside, the mound split open like rotten fruit, and pale figures began to emerge. Children, dozens of them, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow, but their voices joining Miriam's song in a chorus of loss and longing. "What have you done?" Elmira screamed, clutching her iron key so tightly that blood began to seep between her fingers. "The compact. The binding. You're destroying everything." But Miriam only sang louder, and the dead children pressed against the windows of the house, their small hands leaving prints on the glass as they tried to reach the living girl whose voice had called them back from whatever hell they had been consigned to. The night was far from over, and the true horror was only beginning. The song that poured from Miriam's throat was unlike anything the living world had ever heard. It was beautiful and terrible, sweet and sorrowful, a melody that seemed to bridge the gap between breath and stillness, between memory and oblivion. As her voice rose and fell in patterns that predated human language, the very foundations of the Whitlock orphanage trembled in response. The dead children pressed closer to the windows, their hollow eyes fixed on the girl whose song had called them back from their earthly rest. They had been silent for so long, months, years, some of them nearly a decade, buried without names, without markers, without anyone to remember that they had ever drawn breath, or dreamed dreams, or loved the warmth of sunlight on their faces. But now they were remembered. Now they had a voice. Elmira stumbled backward, her face a mask of terror and rage. The iron key around her neck had grown hot enough to burn her skin, but she clutched it desperately, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to sanity. "Stop her," she shrieked at the man in black. "Make her stop before she ruins everything." The creature that wore the shape of a man raised his unnaturally long fingers, and the air around Miriam began to thicken like honey, making it harder for her to breathe, harder to sustain the notes that were unraveling years of careful preparation. But even as her voice wavered, the chorus outside grew stronger, as if the dead children were lending her their own lost breath. Jonah and Elias flanked Miriam protectively, their young faces set with determination that should have been impossible at their age. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they understood enough. Their friend was the key to something vast and terrible, and they would die before they let anyone use her for their own dark purposes. "The compact requires willing sacrifice," the man in black hissed, his form beginning to blur at the edges, as if he was smoke trying to hold human shape. "If she will not come willingly, then the debt must be paid another way." His gaze swept across the assembled children like a scythe through wheat, weighing and measuring each soul. 37 vessels were promised. 37 shall be delivered, one way or another. But Miriam's song was changing, evolving from the haunting melody she had begun into something more complex, more purposeful. It was as if she were learning a language she had always known but never spoken, the language of the dead, the tongue of the forgotten, the voice of those who had been silenced but never truly stilled. Ruth, the brave girl who had tried so hard to warn them, stepped forward from the huddle of terrified children. "I remember them," she said, her voice barely audible above Miriam's singing. "I remember their names, Thomas Whitmore, who used to give me his apple when I was too sick to eat. Mary Catherine Mills, who sang lullabies to the little ones when they had nightmares. Samuel Morrison, who carved toy horses from twigs and pretended they could fly." As she spoke each name, the corresponding figure outside the windows seemed to grow more solid, more real. The dead children were feeding on remembrance, growing stronger with each acknowledgement of their existence, their lives, their individual worth. Elmira let out a wail of despair. "You don't understand what you're doing. The binding requires forgetting. They must be nameless, faceless, lost to memory, or they cannot serve their purpose." "What purpose?" Jonah demanded, his green eyes blazing with fury. "What were you using them for?" The man in black laughed. a sound like winter wind through bare branches. Power boy, the power that comes from commanding the dead. Each child bound to this place became another thread in a web of influence, another voice in a choir of the damned. And she, he gestured toward Miriam, was to be the conductor of that choir, the living soul that would direct their eternal service. But even as he spoke, his form was becoming less solid, less substantial. The song that poured from Miriam's throat was unraveling whatever dark magic had given him shape and substance in the world of the living. The contract in Elmira's ledger was dissolving, the careful arrangements of years crumbling under the weight of names spoken and lives remembered. Through the windows, more figures were appearing, not just the children who had died at the orphanage, but others, older spirits drawn by the power of Miriam's voice. Men and women who had suffered and died in the Alabama hills, slaves who had been worked to death in cotton fields, soldiers who had fallen in forgotten skirmishes, travelers who had disappeared on lonely roads. All of them had been voiceless, nameless, forgotten, until now. The very air in the room began to shimmer and twist, as if reality itself were bending under the strain of so many lost souls pressing close to the world of the living. The man in black let out a shriek of rage and frustration as he felt his grip on the material world slipping away. "If I cannot have the willing vessel," he snarled, "then I will take her by force." He lunged toward Miriam with talons extended, but Elias threw himself into the creature's path, his small wooden doll clutched in his hand like a talisman. The carved face seemed to glow with its own inner light, the light of innocence preserved, of childhood remembered and cherished. The man in black recoiled as if struck, his form wavering like smoke in a strong wind. "You can't touch what's protected by love," Elias said, his voice steady despite his terror. "And you can't break what's held together by memory." All around them, the living children began to speak names, not just of the dead, but of each other, of friends and family left behind, of every person who had ever mattered to them. They were weaving a tapestry of remembrance, creating a barrier of human connection that the darkness could not cross. Miriam's song reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the stars themselves, and in response the field outside erupted in light. The dead children rose from their unmarked graves, not as shambling corpses, but as radiant spirits, free at last from the binding that had held them to earth. One by one they began to fade, their forms dissolving into points of light that drifted upward into the night sky. But before they vanished entirely, each one turned to look through the windows at the girl whose voice had set them free. Their expressions were no longer hollow or hungry. They were grateful, peaceful, complete. They had been remembered, and in being remembered, they had found their way home. Elmira collapsed to her knees, her iron key crumbling to rust between her fingers. Without the power of the bound dead to sustain her, she began to age rapidly, her hair turning white, her skin wrinkling and sagging, as the years she had cheated death came rushing back to claim her. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice now thin and cracked with age. "What have you done to me?" But no one answered her. The man in black had vanished entirely, his form unable to maintain coherence without the foundation of forgotten souls to anchor him. The dead children had found their rest, their light fading into the darkness like stars at dawn. And in the sudden silence that followed the end of Miriam's song, the living children heard something they had never heard before in that house. Peace. But the night was not over, and the cost of their victory had yet to be fully revealed. For some songs once sung changed the singer forever, and Miriam's voice had opened doorways that could never quite be closed again. In the aftermath of the song that shattered a decade of dark binding, the Whitlock orphanage stood transformed. Where once there had been an atmosphere of oppressive dread, now there was something else, a hollow emptiness, like the silence that follows thunder. The living children huddled together in the main hall, their eyes wide with exhaustion and wonder, trying to process what they had witnessed. Miriam had collapsed after her song ended, her small body trembling with the effort of channeling forces far beyond her understanding. Elias knelt beside her, cradling her head in his lap, while Jonah kept watch at the windows where the dead children had pressed their faces just moments before. The glass still bore the faint imprints of small hands, but the spirits themselves had vanished, leaving only the memory of their grateful farewell. Elmira Whitlock, once the iron-willed mistress of the orphanage, now appeared as she truly was, a woman of nearly 80 years, kept alive far beyond her natural span by powers that had finally abandoned her. She crawled across the floor on hands and knees, searching desperately for the pieces of her rusted key, as if collecting them might somehow restore what she had lost. But it was Jonah who first noticed that their ordeal was far from over. "Look," he whispered, pointing toward the windows that faced the field. "Something's wrong." Where the mounds had been, where the dead children had clawed their way free from their earthly prison, the ground was not settling back into peaceful rest. Instead, it was moving, writhing, as if something far larger and more terrible than lost spirits was stirring beneath the Alabama soil. The temperature in the room began to drop rapidly, their breath misting in the air as frost spread across the windows. But this was not the clean cold of winter. It was the chill of the grave, the arctic breath of things that should not be. "The binding is broken," Elmira croaked from the floor, her aged voice barely audible. "But breaking a compact with the dark powers, there are consequences, terrible consequences." As if summoned by her words, a sound began to emanate from beneath the house, a scratching, clawing noise that spoke of something with many teeth and too many legs fighting its way up from the depths of the earth. The floorboards began to buckle and warp, and thin streams of black liquid seeped through the cracks. "What did you do?" Jonah demanded, grabbing Elmira's bony shoulders and forcing her to look at him. "What kind of deal did you make?" The old woman's rheumy eyes filled with tears of terror. "I was young," she whispered. "My husband was dead. My own children were taken by fever. I was going to lose the house, lose everything. When he came to me, the man in black, he offered me a bargain. 37 souls in exchange for power, for long life, for dominion over death itself." "But why children?" Elias asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "Why innocence?" "Because innocence has power," Elmira replied, her words tumbling out in a rush of confession. "The younger the soul, the brighter it burns, the more energy it provides. I told myself I was saving them, taking in orphans who would have died anyway, giving their deaths meaning. But the truth," she broke off, sobbing. "The truth is you were feeding them something evil," Ruth said, her young voice hard with accusation, "using their deaths to buy yourself more life." The scratching sound from below grew louder, more insistent, and now they could hear something else. A voice speaking in a language that predated human civilization, calling out in tones of rage and hunger. Miriam stirred in Elias's arms, her blue eyes fluttering open, but when she spoke, her voice was different. Older, layered with harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. "The feeder rises," she said, though her lips barely moved. "The compact is broken, but a debt remains. It will have its due, one way or another." "What's the feeder?" Jonah asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. It was not Miriam who answered, but the voices of the dead children, speaking through her as they had never been able to speak in life. Ancient things. Older than memory, it feeds on fear, on suffering, on the final breath of the innocent. She promised 37 souls, and 37 it will have. The floor in the center of the room began to buckle upward, forming a mound that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. Whatever was coming was close now, so close they could smell it, the stench of decay and old blood, of things that had rotted in the dark for centuries. "We have to run," Jonah said, moving toward the door. "Now while we still can." But as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with supernatural force. The windows too began to rattle and shake, their frames warping until escape through them became impossible. They were trapped, sealed in with whatever was clawing its way up from the depths of the earth. "No running," Miriam said, though the voice was still not entirely her own. "The feeder must be fed, or it will consume everything, not just us but the entire county. It will spread like plague, devouring innocence wherever it finds it." Elias held her tighter, tears streaming down his face. "There has to be another way. There has to be something we can do." The mound in the center of the floor split open with a wet, tearing sound, and from the hole emerged something that defied description. It was shadow and substance both. A writhing mass of tentacles and teeth and eyes that burned with hunger. The feeder had come to claim what it was owed. But as it began to pull itself fully into the room, Miriam struggled to her feet, pushing away from Elias despite his attempts to hold her back. The voices of the dead children were stronger now, speaking through her with increasing clarity. "One willing soul," they said through her lips. "One freely given, worth more than 37 taken by force. The compact can be fulfilled, the debt settled, but only if the sacrifice is made with love instead of fear." "No," Elias said fiercely, understanding what she meant to do. But Miriam smiled at him with infinite sadness and infinite compassion. "Don't you see? This is why I'm here. This is why my voice could call them back. Why I could break Elmira's binding. I was always meant to be the bridge between the living and the dead." The feeder had fully emerged now, its massive bulk filling half the room, its attention fixed on the terrified children with unmistakable hunger. But as Miriam began to sing again, not the desperate, powerful song that had freed the dead, but something gentler, more accepting, the creature paused. "I offer myself," she said, her young voice carrying clearly over the monster's breathing. "Not in fear, but in love. Not for power, but for peace. Take me, and let the others go." The feeder's many eyes turned toward her, and in them the children saw something unexpected, a flicker of what might have been uncertainty, or even respect. "Freely given," the dead children whispered through Miriam's lips, "with love, not fear. The compact changes. The debt transforms." But before the creature could respond, Jonah stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward Miriam. "If you go, I go too. We're family now. Families stick together." Elias joined him, then Ruth, then one by one every child in the room. They linked hands, forming a circle around Miriam, their young faces set with determination. "Together," they said as one, "whatever happens, we face it together." The feeder reared back, confused by this display of unity and love. It had been summoned to consume fear and desperation, to feed on the terror of the helpless. But these children offered something else entirely: courage, sacrifice, the kind of pure love that transforms everything it touches. In the growing light of dawn, for somehow impossibly they had survived until morning, the creature began to change, its monstrous form wavering and shifting like smoke in the wind. But the price of their defiance had yet to be fully paid, and the sun that rose over the Alabama hills would illuminate a scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Dawn broke over the Alabama hills like a wound in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of blood and amber. Inside the Whitlock orphanage, the children stood in their protective circle, hands linked, hearts hammering as they faced the writhing mass of shadow and hunger that had emerged from beneath their feet. But something was changing in the feeder. The presence of their united courage, their willingness to face death together rather than let their friend sacrifice herself alone, was working a transformation that none of them could have anticipated. The creature's form, which had been solid and terrible just moments before, began to waver like a heat shimmer on a summer road. Miriam, still serving as a conduit for the voices of the dead children, spoke in harmonics that made the air itself tremble. "Love changes everything," the spirit said through her lips. "Fear feeds the darkness. But love transforms it." The feeder's many eyes blinked in confusion, its tentacles writhing less aggressively as it tried to process this unexpected development. For centuries, perhaps millennia, it had known only one kind of summoning, desperate bargains made by those who would sacrifice others to save themselves. It had grown fat on the terror of the innocent, the despair of the helpless, the final screams of those who died alone and forgotten. But these children offered something different. They offered themselves not out of desperation, but out of love for each other. They faced death, not with screams, but with songs. They chose unity over survival, sacrifice over safety. And the ancient hunger that had driven the feeder for so long began to. The compact was built on fear. Elmira croaked from where she lay crumpled on the floor, her voice now thin and reedy with age. 37 souls taken in terror. Their deaths used to fuel my bargain with darkness. But if the debt is paid with love instead of fear. She trailed off, staring at the transforming creature with something that might have been wonderful. In all her years of dealing with the powers beyond the veil, she had never considered that there might be another way. Jonah, still gripping Miriam's hand tightly, felt something shift in the air around them. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the orphanage for so long was lifting, replaced by something else, not lightness exactly, but a sense of possibility, of choices yet to be made. "What's happening?" he whispered. It was Ruth who answered, her voice filled with awe. "It's remembering," she said. "The thing that became the feeder, it's remembering what it used to be." As she spoke, the creature's form continued to change. The writhing tentacles were condensing, taking on more recognizable shapes. The burning eyes were softening, becoming less predatory and more human. The teeth that had filled its maw were receding, replaced by something that might have been a mouth capable of speech, rather than just consumption. Through Miriam, the dead children began to tell a story, not in words but in images that flowed directly into the minds of the living. They saw the feeder as it had been long ago, before hunger had twisted it into something monstrous. It had been a guardian once, a protector of the innocent, a being whose purpose was to comfort the dying and guide lost souls to their rest. But fear had corrupted it. The terror of those it was meant to help had seeped into its essence like poison, transforming compassion into hunger, guidance into predation. Over the centuries it had forgotten its original purpose, becoming nothing more than an appetite for suffering. Now faced with children who offered love instead of fear, sacrifice instead of terror, it was beginning to remember what it had been meant to be. The transformation was not swift or smooth. The creature convulsed and writhed as eons of corruption fought against the memory of its original nature. Black ichor poured from its changing form, pooling on the floor and filling the air with the stench of decay. The children held fast to each other, their circle unbroken despite the horror unfolding before them. But gradually, miraculously, something beautiful began to emerge from the writhing mass. The thing that had been the feeder was condensing, taking on a more humanoid form. Where there had been tentacles, now there were arms. Where there had been burning eyes, now there was a face, ancient beyond measure, marked by eons of sorrow, but undeniably filled with the memory of compassion. "I remember," it said, and its voice was like wind through cathedral spires, like the sound of rain on stone, like the whisper of pages turning in an ancient book. "I remember what I was meant to be." The being that had once been the feeder looked down at the children with eyes that held depths of time and experience beyond human comprehension. "You have given me the greatest gift," it said. "You have reminded me of love." But even as it spoke, they could see that the transformation was taking its toll. The being's form was becoming less solid, more translucent, as if the act of remembering its true nature was causing it to fade from the physical world. "The compact has ended," it continued, its voice growing fainter. "The debt is paid, not with fear but with love. The children who died here are free, and you who live shall remain free. But It paused, a smile crossing its ancient features. I must return to what I was meant to be. I must go back to guiding souls home. As the sun rose higher outside the windows, painting the room in golden light, the being began to dissolve into points of brilliance that drifted upward like reverse snow. But before it vanished entirely, it turned its fading gaze to Miriam. "Your voice opened the door between worlds," it said. "That gift will remain with you always. Use it wisely. Use it with love." And then it was gone, leaving behind only the memory of its presence and a profound sense of peace that settled over the orphanage, like a blessing. But their ordeal was not quite over. Elmira Whitlock, now appearing every day of her true age and more, struggled to her feet with the determination of someone who knew her time was running short. "The ledger," she gasped, pointing toward the stairs that led to her private quarters. "It must be destroyed. As long as it exists, there's a chance the compact could be renewed by another. Burn it. Burn it. All." Jonah looked at the old woman who had caused so much suffering, who had traded the lives of innocent children for her own extended existence. Part of him wanted to let her face whatever consequences awaited her. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected: genuine remorse and a desperate desire to make amends for the terrible things she had done. "I'll get it," he said, releasing Miriam's hand and heading for the stairs. But as he climbed toward Elmira's quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that their victory, complete as it seemed, had come at a price that was only beginning to reveal itself. The feeder was gone, the dead children were at rest, and the compact was broken. But some doors, once opened, can never be entirely closed again. And Miriam's gift, her ability to speak with the dead, to bridge the gap between the living and the spirit world, would ensure that their lives would never be quite ordinary again. Behind him, in the golden morning light streaming through the windows of the main hall, Miriam began to hum softly. It was not the desperate song that had freed the dead, or the accepting melody that had transformed the feeder. This was something new, a lullaby perhaps, or a hymn of hope. But even in its beauty, there was something haunting about the sound, something that suggested the story of the Whitlock orphanage was far from over. The ledger burned like a living thing, its pages curling and blackening in the flames of the kitchen hearth, while an oily black smoke rose from its destruction. Jonah watched the fire consume years of careful record-keeping, each number that had once been a living child disappearing into ash and memory. But even as the physical evidence of Elmira's crimes turned to nothing, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had merely won a battle, not the war. 3 days had passed since the feeder's transformation and departure. 3 days of uneasy peace while the children tried to adjust to a world without Elmira's iron rule and constant fear. The old woman herself had aged rapidly since losing her supernatural protection, growing frailer by the hour until she was confined to her bed, barely able to speak above a whisper. The orphanage felt different now, lighter in some ways, but also empty, like a house where all the clocks have stopped ticking. The other children moved through their daily routines with a kind of shell-shocked calm, unsure what to do with their newfound freedom. Some spoke of leaving, of trying to find their way back to whatever families might still remember them. Others clung to the familiar walls and routines, afraid that the world beyond might hold even greater terrors than what they had already faced. But it was Miriam who concerned Elias most. Since the night of the Great Transformation, she had grown increasingly distant, spending hours staring out at the field where the unmarked graves had once dotted the earth. The soil had settled now, showing no trace of the horrors it had contained, but Miriam seemed to see something there that the rest of them could not. "She's still singing to them," Elias confided to Jonah as they worked in the garden, trying to coax life from earth that had known too much death. "I hear her at night, humming those songs that call to the dead. But they're gone now, aren't they? They've found their rest." Jonah straightened from his weeding, brushing dirt from his hands as he considered the question. In the days since the feeder's departure, he had felt a growing unease that he couldn't quite articulate. The supernatural threat was ended, The immediate danger passed, but something still felt wrong, like the moment of quiet before a thunderstorm breaks. "Most of them are gone," he said carefully. "But Miriam's gift, when she opened that door between the worlds, I don't think it closed all the way behind her. I think she can still hear them, not just the children who were buried here, but others. All the lost souls who never found their way home." Their conversation was interrupted by a scream from inside the house, high-pitched, terrified, unmistakably young. The boys dropped their tools and ran toward the sound, their hearts hammering with the fear that their nightmare was beginning again. They found Ruth in the main hall, pointing with a trembling finger toward the windows that faced the field. "Look," she gasped. "Oh God, look what's happening." The field was moving again, but not in the violent earth-splitting way it had 3 nights before. This time the soil was shifting gently, almost lovingly, as if something beneath were trying to surface without causing damage. Small mounds were forming, not graves this time, but something else. Something that pulsed with its own inner light. "Miriam," Elias called, racing up the stairs toward the girls' dormitory. "Miriam, you need to see this." But when he reached her bed, he found it empty. The covers thrown back as if she had risen in haste. Panic seized him as he searched the room, calling her name, until Ruth's voice reached him from below. "She's outside," Ruth called. "She's in the field." They found her there, standing among the glowing mounds in her white nightgown, her arms raised toward the morning sky. But she was not alone. Translucent figures surrounded her, not the tormented spirits of the dead children, but other souls, dozens of them, all drawn by the power of her voice. These were not the recent dead, but spirits who had been wandering for decades, perhaps centuries. Lost souls who had never found their way to whatever came after life, trapped in the liminal space between worlds by their own fear, their own unfinished business, their own inability to let go of earthly concerns. And Miriam was calling them home. Her song was different now, not the desperate cry that had freed the orphaned dead, not the accepting melody that had transformed the feeder, but something that was purely her own. It was a lullaby and a dirge, a welcome and a farewell, a bridge built of sound and love that offered passage to those who had been denied it for too long. "She's trying to help them all," Jonah breathed, understanding flooding through him. "Every lost soul, every spirit that can't find its way, she thinks it's her responsibility." But even as they watched, they could see the toll it was taking on her. With each soul that answered her call and found its way to whatever peace awaited beyond the veil, Miriam grew a little more translucent herself, a little more distant from the world of the living. "She's giving too much of herself," Elias said, starting forward. "She's going to fade away like they are." But before he could reach her, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "Let her finish." They turned to see Elmira Whitlock standing in the doorway of the orphanage, leaning heavily on a walking stick, her ancient face etched with lines of pain and regret. She looked like she had aged another 10 years overnight, but her eyes were clear and determined. "This is her choice," the old woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "her gift, her burden, her decision. I took the choice away from 37 children and damned them all. I won't take choice from her." "But she'll die," Elias protested, tears streaming down his face. "She'll use up everything she has helping them, and then she'll be gone too." Elmira nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the girl in the field who was surrounded by grateful spirits. "Perhaps, or perhaps she'll find a different kind of life, one that exists between worlds, serving as a guide for the lost and the forgotten. I don't know. But I know this, she's doing what I should have done decades ago. She's choosing love over fear, service over self-preservation." In the field, Miriam's song reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the stars themselves. The spirits around her began to fade one by one, their forms dissolving into points of light that spiraled upward into the morning sky. Each departure brought a smile to Miriam's face, a sense of completion and joy that was beautiful to witness. But with each soul she helped find its way home, she became a little less solid herself, a little more like the spirits she was guiding. The boundaries between life and death, between the physical world and the realm of souls, were blurring around her. As the last of the wandering dead found their peace and faded into light, Miriam turned toward her friends with a smile that held infinite sadness and infinite love. She was barely visible now, more memory than substance, but her voice still carried clearly on the morning air. "Don't mourn for me," she said, her words like the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. "This is what I was meant for. This is why I was given the gift. I'm not dying. I'm becoming something else, something that can help others find their way home." Ilias reached out toward her, but his hand passed through her form like she was made of mist. "Will we see you again?" he asked, his voice breaking. Miriam's smile grew brighter, more radiant, as she began to fade entirely. "Listen for my voice in the wind," she said. "Look for my light in the darkness. I'll always be here, always be watching over you, always sing the lost ones home." And then she was gone, leaving only the echo of her song and the memory of her love. In the silence that followed, the surviving children stood together in the empty field, their hearts breaking and healing at the same time. They had lost their friend, but they had also witnessed something beautiful, a soul choosing to transform itself in service of others, a love so pure it transcended the boundaries between life and death. But even in their grief, they knew that Miriam's story had not ended. It was changed, transformed, elevated to something beyond ordinary human experience. She had become what she was always meant to be, a bridge between worlds, a voice for the voiceless, a light in the darkness for all who had lost their way. And in the years to come, whenever travelers in the Alabama hills spoke of hearing children's laughter on the wind, or of seeing a gentle light that guided them safely through the darkest nights, those who had known Miriam Whitlock would smile and know that she was still there, still singing, still helping the lost find their way home. The Alabama hills had never known a night quite like this one. 3 months had passed since Miriam's transformation, 3 months of uneasy peace as the surviving children tried to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of tragedy and wonder. The Whitlock orphanage still stood, but it was no longer a place of dread. Under the guidance of a kindly couple from Montgomery, who had come to investigate reports of supernatural disturbances, it had become something closer to what it should have always been, a true home for children who had nowhere else to go. But peace, as Jonah had learned, was often just the calm before another storm. It began with the dreams. Every child in the orphanage started having them on the same night, visions of Miriam standing in that same field, but she was no longer alone. Dozens of spirits surrounded her, not the peaceful souls she had helped find their way home, but something else, something angry, something that had been awakened by the great working of power 3 months before. These were not the recent dead, or even the ancient wanderers who had been trapped between worlds. These were the truly forgotten, souls so old, so lost, so consumed by their own anger and despair, that they had become something other than human. They had been drawn by Miriam's song, but not to find peace. They had come to demand justice, to settle scores that had been festering for centuries. Elias woke from his dream with Miriam's name on his lips and the taste of grave dirt in his mouth. Across the dormitory, he could see that the other boys were stirring restlessly, caught in their own versions of the same terrible vision. Outside, storm clouds were gathering with unnatural speed, turning the night sky black as pitch. "She's in trouble," he whispered to Jonah, who was already sitting up in his bed, his green eyes wide with the memory of what he had seen in sleep. "Something's wrong. She needs our help." But even as he spoke, they both knew it was more complicated than that. Miriam existed now in a realm between life and death, serving as a bridge for lost souls, seeking passage to whatever came after. They were merely mortal children, with no power to reach across that divide. How could they possibly help her fight battles in a world they could barely comprehend? The answer came from an unexpected source. Elmira Whitlock, now ancient beyond her years and confined to a wheelchair, appeared in the doorway of the dormitory. She should not have been able to climb the stairs in her condition, but desperation had given her strength beyond her physical capabilities. "I can feel them gathering," she said, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the storm-charged air. "The truly lost ones, the ones who died in rage and never let go of their earthly hatred. They've come for her." "Why?" Ruth asked, emerging from the girls' dormitory with several of her companions. All of them bore the look of children who had seen too much, whose innocence had been carved away by experience but whose courage remained intact. "Why would they want to hurt Miriam? She's only trying to help them." Elmira's ancient eyes filled with tears of shame and regret. "Because I taught them that kindness was a weakness, that love was something to be exploited. For decades I used the power of the dead to fuel my own desires, twisting their purpose, corrupting their rest. Some of them learned those lessons too well. They became predators like the feeder was, but worse, they kept their human cunning, their ability to deceive and manipulate. Through the windows they could see the field beginning to change again, but this time the earth wasn't glowing with gentle light. It was cracking and splitting, revealing pits of absolute darkness from which nothing good could emerge. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and frost was forming on the glass despite the fact that it was still autumn. "What do they want?" Jonah asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "Her power," Elmira replied. "They want to corrupt her gift, to turn her voice from a beacon of hope into an instrument of vengeance. If they succeed, every soul she touches will become like them, lost, angry, eternally seeking to drag others down into their misery." The old woman struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her walking stick, her face set with grim determination. "There is a way to stop them, but it requires something I swore I would never do again. It requires calling on powers that should remain undisturbed." "No," Elias said fiercely. "We won't let you make another deal with darkness. Haven't enough people suffered for your bargains?" But Elmira shook her head, a sad smile crossing her weathered features. "Not a bargain, child. A sacrifice. The opposite of everything I did before. I spent decades taking power from others to fuel my own existence. Now I offer my remaining life force freely, to protect the one person who might be able to heal the damage I've done." Before any of them could protest, she began to speak words in a language none of them recognized, not the dark tongue that had once summoned the feeder, but something older, purer, a language of creation rather than destruction. As she spoke, her already frail form began to shimmer and fade, her life essence flowing out of her like light from a dying candle. But instead of darkness claiming her, the light that left her body streamed through the windows and across the field toward where Miriam's translucent form could barely be seen, surrounded by the writhing shadows of the truly lost dead. "Tell her," Elmira whispered as her voice began to fail. "Tell her that she doesn't have to save them all. Some souls choose their own damnation. Tell her it's all right to let go of those who refuse to be helped." And then she was gone, her body crumbling to dust that was immediately swept away by the wind howling through the broken windows. But her final gift, the offering of her own remaining life force, had reached its intended target. In the field, Miriam's form suddenly blazed with renewed strength and clarity. The shadows that had been pressing close to her recoiled from the unexpected influx of power, hissing and writhing like serpents caught in sunlight. But they did not retreat far. They were too numerous, too angry, too committed to their course of revenge to be easily deterred. The battle for Miriam's soul, and for the fate of all the spirits she might guide in the years to come, was about to begin. But she would not fight it alone. Even as the living children watched helplessly from the windows of the orphanage, other figures began to appear in the field. The spirits of the children Miriam had helped find their way home were returning, not as lost souls seeking passage, but as guardians determined to protect the one who had shown them such kindness. Thomas was there, sweet, quiet Thomas who had been the first to disappear from the orphanage. Mary Catherine Mills, who had sung lullabies to comfort the frightened. Samuel Morrison, who had carved toy horses and dreamed of flight. All 36 of the children who had died under Elmira's care, now transformed into beings of light and love, standing between Miriam and the forces that would corrupt her gift. The living children pressed their faces to the windows, watching as the battle unfolded in realms beyond their physical senses. They could not see the details clearly, could not make out the individual struggles between light and shadow, but they could feel the power radiating from the conflict, hope warring against despair, love fighting hatred, the dream of peace battling the reality of eternal rage. And through it all, Miriam's voice rose in song, not the gentle lullabies she had sung to guide souls home, but something new and powerful, a hymn of defiance that declared her refusal to let her gift be perverted into an instrument of harm. The battle raged until dawn, when the first rays of sunlight pierced the storm clouds and fell across the contested field. As the light touched the ground, the shadows of the truly lost began to retreat, unable to maintain their coherence in the face of Miriam's protected radiance. But even in victory, there was cost. Several of the guardian spirits, the returned children who had fought to protect her, had been wounded in the conflict, their light dimmed by contact with the forces of despair. They would recover, but slowly, and the memory of what they had faced would stay with them. Miriam herself stood triumphant but changed. The innocence that had marked her in life was gone, replaced by a deeper understanding of the darkness that could claim even the most well-intentioned souls. She had learned that not every spirit could be saved, that some chose their own damnation so completely that any attempt to help them only spread their corruption further. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. In the years to come, as she continued her work guiding lost souls to their rest, she would need the wisdom to distinguish between those who truly sought peace and those who merely sought to drag others down into their own misery. As the sun rose fully over the Alabama hills, bringing with it the promise of a new day, the surviving children of the Whitlock orphanage finally allowed themselves to believe that their trials were truly over. The field was quiet now, showing no sign of the supernatural battle that had raged across it during the night. But sometimes, if they listened carefully, they could still hear Miriam's voice on the wind, not sad now, but strong and sure, a beacon of hope for any lost soul brave enough to seek the light. 5 years had passed since the night of the great battle. 5 years since Miriam Whitlock had taken her place as guardian of the boundary between life and death. The orphanage had been rebuilt under new management, its dark history officially forgotten, but never entirely erased. The children who had survived those terrible months had grown and scattered, some adopted into loving families, others making their own way in the world with the strange wisdom that comes from facing the impossible and living to tell the tale. But Elias had never left. Now 17 and serving as an assistant to the new headmaster, he had made the orphanage his permanent home, unable to abandon the place where he had lost and found so much. Every morning, he walked the grounds that had once trembled with supernatural terror, tending the gardens that now bloomed with ordinary flowers, maintaining the peace that had been so hard won. And every evening he visited the field. Where once there had been unmarked graves filled with the nameless dead, now there was something else, a grove of young pine trees, each one planted by Elias himself in memory of a child who had died without recognition. He could not carve their names into stone, for most of those names had been lost to time and Elmira's deliberate erasure of their identities. But he could give them this living memorials that would grow tall and strong, reaching always toward the light. Beneath each tree, he had buried one of his wooden dolls' small carved faces that captured not any specific child, but the essence of childhood itself, the innocence and wonder that death could steal, but memory could preserve. It was his way of saying that they had mattered, that they had existed, that someone remembered. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the Alabama hills in shades of gold and crimson, Elias was not alone in his vigil. Jonah had returned for a visit, now 20, and bearing the confident bearing of a young man who had made his mark in the world beyond the orphanage. He worked for a newspaper in Atlanta, writing stories that exposed corruption and gave voice to those who had been silenced by power and privilege. "Any word from her lately?" Jonah asked, settling beside his old friend on the wooden bench they had built at the edge of the grove. Elias smiled, pointing toward a particular pine tree that stood slightly apart from the others, larger, older, its branches extending in graceful arcs that seemed to dance in the slightest breeze. "She's always here," he said. "Not in the way she used to be, but present, watching. Sometimes when the wind is just right, you can hear her humming." As if summoned by his words, a gentle breeze stirred through the grove, and for just a moment the two young men could swear they heard something musical in the whisper of wind through pine needles, a melody that was achingly familiar yet somehow new, a song that spoke of peace found and duties willingly undertaken. "The new children don't know the whole story," Elias continued, his voice soft with memory. "We tell them parts of it, about the importance of remembering those who came before, about the power of standing together against darkness. But the rest is too much for young minds to carry." Jonah nodded, understanding. They had all agreed, the survivors of that terrible time, that the full truth of what had happened at the Whitlock orphanage should be preserved, but shared carefully. Some stories were too powerful, too dangerous, to be told lightly. "Ruth writes to me sometimes," Jonah said, pulling a letter from his coat pocket. "She's become a teacher in Birmingham, working with children who've lost their families. She says she can sometimes sense things, spirits that need help moving on, places where the boundary between worlds has grown thin. Nothing like what Miriam can do, but enough to make a difference." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The grove around them was peaceful, filled with the simple sounds of evening, birds settling in for the night, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through branches. But as full darkness fell, something changed. The temperature dropped slightly, not with the bone-deep chill that had once marked supernatural danger, but with the gentle coolness of a summer evening. And in that coolness, shapes began to form among the trees, translucent, glowing softly, unmistakably the figures of children. Not the tormented spirits they had once been, trapped between life and death by Elmira's cruel binding. These were peaceful souls, content in their eternal rest, but drawn back for a brief moment by love and gratitude. Thomas was there, and Mary Catherine and Samuel, and all the others whose names had been lost but whose memories lived on in carved wood and growing trees. And in the center of the gathering, more solid and radiant than the rest, stood Miriam. She looked much as she had in life, but transformed, older, somehow wiser, bearing the serene expression of someone who had found her true purpose. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly to the two young men on the bench, though her lips barely moved. "Thank you," she said, her words encompassing not just gratitude but love, recognition, and something that might have been a blessing. "For remembering, for keeping the story alive, to make sure that what happened here will never happen again." Behind her, the spirits of the other children nodded in agreement, their forms flickering like candle flames in a gentle wind. They were not bound to this place any longer, not trapped by unfinished business or unresolved pain. They had found their peace, their rest, their way home. But love had called them back for this one moment, this brief reunion with the friends who had survived. "We miss you," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day we miss you." Miriam's smile was radiant, filling the grove with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "I'm never really gone," she replied. "Every time you help someone who's lost, every time you choose love over fear, Every time you remember that every soul matters, I'm there, we all are." She gestured toward the other spirits, who were beginning to fade as the moment of connection reached its natural end. "The work continues," she said, "in this world and beyond, and we're all part of it, all connected by the choices we make and the love we share." As her form grew more translucent, Miriam raised her hand in farewell. "Take care of each other," she whispered. "Remember us not with sorrow, but with joy. And know that someday when your own work is done, we'll be waiting to welcome you home." And then they were gone, leaving only the memory of their presence and a sense of peace that seemed to settle over the grove like a blessing. The pine trees rustled in the evening breeze, their branches reaching toward stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Elias and Jonah sat for a long time after the visitation ended, each lost in his own thoughts and memories. Finally, as the night grew deeper and the first chill of approaching winter touched the air, they rose to return to the orphanage. But before they left the grove, Elias paused beside the largest pine tree, the one that served as Miriam's memorial. From his pocket, he pulled a small wooden figure, newly carved, bearing the face of a child he had never met, but whose story had reached him through the newspapers. Another lost soul, another forgotten victim of adult cruelty and indifference. He buried the doll carefully at the base of the tree, adding it to the collection of memories that lived beneath the earth. As he did, he whispered a promise to himself, to Miriam, to all the children who had suffered and died in darkness. "You will be remembered," he said. "Your names may be lost, but your lives will not be forgotten. Someone will always know that you were here, that you mattered, that you deserved better than what this world gave you." The wind stirred through the branches above him, and for just a moment he could swear he heard the echo of children's laughter, not the bitter sound of the tormented dead, but the pure joy of souls at peace, free at last to play and sing, and remember what it meant to be happy. Years would pass, and the grove would grow larger as Elias continued his work of remembrance. The orphanage would prosper under its new management, becoming a place of genuine hope and healing. The children who had survived the dark times would go on to live meaningful lives, carrying with them the lessons they had learned about courage and sacrifice and the power of standing together against the darkness. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, travelers passing through the Alabama hills would hear something beautiful drifting from the grove of pine trees, a song without words, a hymn of remembrance, a voice that bridged the gap between what was and what could never be forgotten. They would pause in their journey, touched by something they couldn't quite name, and for a moment they would remember their own lost loved ones, their own griefs and joys, their own need to ensure that love persists even after life has ended. Then they would continue on their way, carrying with them the echo of that song, the knowledge that somewhere in the world someone was still singing the lost one's home. And in the grove of memorial pines, where graves had once held nameless bones but now sheltered growing wood and living memory, the work of remembrance continued, quiet, persistent, eternal. For the earth remembers what the world chooses to forget, and love endures long after the last breath has been drawn. In the end, that was Miriam's greatest gift. Not just her ability to speak with the dead, but her reminder that death is not the opposite of love, but simply another form it takes. And in remembering, in honoring, in the simple act of saying you mattered to those who had been forgotten, something sacred persists. The graves remember, the trees remember, and love in all its forms remembers too.